The year is 107 BC. Rome, the mighty republic that once conquered Italy and humbled Carthage, is on the edge of collapse. Foreign enemies close in from every direction. To the north, vast waves of Germanic tribes sweep across Europe, crushing Roman armies with terrifying ease. To the south, in the deserts of North Africa, King Jugurtha of Numidia humiliates Rome with clever ambushes and endless resistance. Inside the Republic, the situation is even worse. The traditional Roman army, once made up of citizen farmers, is falling apart. Decades of war have ruined small farmers, leaving them too poor to serve. The wealthiest elites avoid service or use their influence to escape the front lines. Rome's legions are shrinking, her enemies are growing bolder, and the Senate is paralyzed by corruption and infighting. For the first time in centuries, people begin to whisper, has Rome's time come to an end? But then enters Gaius Marius, a man born not into privilege but into determination. A soldier, a politician, and above all, a reformer. He looks at Rome's failing military system and dares to do the unthinkable, throw tradition aside and build a new kind of army. An army not of farmers, but of professionals. An army drawn from the poorest citizens, forged by discipline, and loyal above all to their commander. This bold experiment will not only rescue Rome from disaster but transform her into the greatest military power the world had ever seen. Yet it will also set in motion changes that will one day bring the Republic crashing down. This is the story of how the Marian Reforms created Rome's unstoppable war machine. The crisis before Marius. To understand why Marius' reforms were so revolutionary, we first need to see the crisis Rome was drowning in before he arrived. For centuries, the Roman army was built on a simple idea: every soldier was also a citizen farmer. When war broke out, men who owned land were called to serve. They brought their own weapons, their own armor, and after the campaign ended, they returned home to tend their fields. This system had worked well during Rome's rise. It created disciplined soldiers with a personal stake in defending their land. But by the late 2nd century BC, this model was falling apart. Rome had been fighting almost non-stop wars for generations. Long campaigns in Spain, Greece, and Africa pulled farmers away from their land for years at a time. Many returned home to find their farms ruined or swallowed up by wealthy aristocrats. These men drifted into the cities, landless and poor, and according to tradition, disqualified from serving in the army. The result? Rome faced a manpower crisis. With fewer small farmers available to serve, the legions shrank just as Rome's enemies grew stronger. The Jugurthine War in North Africa dragged on because the Roman forces sent there were ill-prepared and poorly led. Even worse, in the north, huge Germanic tribes like the Cimbri and Teutons were smashing Roman armies in battle after battle. Entire legions were wiped out. Back in Rome, the Senate squabbled instead of solving the problem. The old aristocratic families clung to tradition, refusing to allow the poor into the army or to provide state-funded equipment. They were blind to the fact that the Republic's very survival was at risk. By the time Gaius Marius rose to power, Rome wasn't just in trouble, she was on the verge of collapse. Without drastic change, the greatest republic in the Mediterranean world could have been crushed by its enemies. Who was Gaius Marius? In this moment of crisis, Rome's unlikely savior appeared, Gaius Marius. Marius was not born into the wealthy senatorial class that traditionally ruled the Republic. Instead, he came from humble origins in the small Italian town of Arpinum, the same town where Cicero would later be born. He was what the Romans called a novus homo, a new man, someone who rose to power without aristocratic family connections. In a society obsessed with bloodlines and heritage, this made him an outsider. But Marius had two things the aristocrats couldn't ignore: ambition and military talent. He climbed the Roman political ladder step by step, serving as a soldier and later as an officer in various campaigns. His reputation grew after he served under Scipio Aemilianus in Spain, where his toughness and discipline earned him respect from both common soldiers and commanders alike. By the late 2nd century BC, Marius had won the support of the Roman people as a man who understood their struggles. He was a soldier's soldier, stern, hardworking, and ruthless when necessary. Unlike many nobles, he wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. In 107 BC, with Rome desperate for solutions, Marius was elected consul, the highest office in the Republic. Almost immediately, he clashed with the Senate. While the aristocrats resisted any change to the old ways, Marius believed that only radical reform could save Rome. He had no intention of letting tradition stand in the way of survival. Marius was not just thinking about winning the war against Jugurtha or the Germanic tribes. He was thinking about reshaping Rome's military for generations to come. His reforms would challenge centuries of tradition, empower the poor, and forever change the relationship between soldier, general, and state. The stage was now set. An outsider with bold ideas had been given command of Rome's armies. And with that, the greatest transformation in Roman military history was about to begin. Opening the army to the poor. The most daring, and controversial, of Marius' reforms was simple but revolutionary. He opened the Roman army to the poorest citizens. For centuries, Rome's army had been built on the idea that only landowners could fight. This was partly practical. Men who owned land could afford weapons and armor, and partly political, since landowners were seen as having the most to lose if Rome fell. But by the late 2nd century BC, this rule had become a disaster. The number of landowning farmers was shrinking, and with it, the pool of available soldiers. Marius shattered this tradition. For the first time in Roman history, the landless poor, the capitancy, or head count, were allowed to enlist. These were men who had nothing, no property, no wealth, often no future. Before Marius, the state had no use for them. Now they were welcomed into the legions. This single decision instantly solved Rome's manpower crisis. Suddenly, there were tens of thousands of eager recruits ready to serve. For these men, joining the army wasn't just about fighting, it was a chance at survival. The army offered steady pay, food, and the promise of loot or land after retirement. For the first time, the poorest Romans could dream of a better future through military service. It was also a masterstroke of social engineering. By giving the poor a role in Rome's defense, Marius bound them to the Republic, but more importantly to himself. These men weren't just fighting for Rome, they were fighting for their general, the man who had given them purpose. To the Senate and old aristocracy, this was shocking. They saw it as dangerous, even reckless, to arm the poor. But Marius had no time for tradition. Rome was dying, and he believed only a new kind of army could save it. The opening of the ranks to the landless poor was the first brick laid in building Rome's professional standing army, a force that would go on to conquer the known world. Standardized training and equipment. Before Marius, Roman soldiers were responsible for equipping themselves. This meant that a wealthy citizen could afford a full set of armor, a strong shield, and quality weapons, while a poorer landowner might fight with cheaper, less reliable gear. The result was an army that looked unified from the outside but, in reality, had uneven standards. Some soldiers were well protected, others were vulnerable, and in battle, that difference could decide life or death. Marius changed this completely. Under his reforms, the state itself began to provide weapons and armor. Every soldier was now issued standardized equipment. The gladius, a short, stabbing sword perfect for close combat. The pilum, a heavy-throwing spear designed to bend on impact so enemies couldn't throw it back. A sturdy scutum, the large curved shield that became the Roman soldier's trademark. A helmet, body armor, and marching pack. For the first time, the Roman army became uniform. Each soldier looked the same, carried the same tools, and trained in the same way. This created not only fairness but also efficiency. A legion now moved and fought as one machine, each part interchangeable with the next. Training also became more rigorous. Marius enforced discipline and endurance drills that pushed recruits to their limits. Soldiers trained to march long distances at speed, dig camps, and build fortifications as part of their routine. They became professionals, hardened for war, instead of part-time fighters who returned to farming after each campaign. This system didn't just prepare them for battle, it gave the Roman legions an edge in every aspect of warfare. They could build roads, set up fortified camps overnight, and march farther and faster than most enemies thought possible. The Roman army was no longer just a citizen militia. Thanks to standardized equipment and professional training, it had become a true standing force, reliable, efficient, and terrifyingly effective. The Marius mules, one of Marius' most practical and legendary reforms, was how his soldiers carried their gear. Before him, much of the army's supplies traveled with large baggage trains pulled by mules and wagons. This slowed the army down and made it dependent on supply lines. If the baggage was attacked or delayed, the soldiers could be left stranded without food or equipment. Marius cut through this problem with a simple but harsh solution: each soldier would carry his own kit. The men were loaded with their weapons, armor, rations, cooking tools, and even materials to build camp. Altogether, the load could weigh up to 90 pounds. The soldiers complained bitterly at first, but soon adapted. They were nicknamed Marius mules because of the heavy burdens they carried. But this reform turned a weakness into a strength. Now, a Roman army could move faster and farther than almost any other force of the time. They no longer needed long supply trains or constant resupply. Each legion was more self-sufficient, able to march deep into enemy territory and set up fortified camps wherever they stopped. This mobility gave Rome a huge advantage. Enemies often underestimated how quickly the legions could appear, ready for battle, with everything they needed carried on their backs. It also toughened the soldiers themselves. By marching under such weight, they became hardened to fatigue and better prepared for the brutal demands of war. The nickname meant to mock them soon became a badge of pride. A Roman soldier was not only a fighter, he was an engineer, a laborer, and a survivor. Thanks to Marius' reforms, each man was a walking war machine, capable of building, marching, and fighting with relentless endurance. Cohort system replaces maniple system. Before Marius, the Roman army fought in the maniple system, a structure that had once been innovative but was becoming outdated. A legion was divided into small units called maniples, each with about 120 men. This gave Rome flexibility on the battlefield. Maniples could move independently and adapt to rough terrain. But as Rome's wars expanded across Europe, Africa, and the East, the maniple system revealed its weaknesses. Commanding so many small groups was complicated, and against large, unified enemy forces, maniples often struggled to hold the line. Marius replaced this with a new system based on cohorts. Instead of 30 maniples, a legion was now divided into 10 cohorts, each with about 480 to 500 men. Each cohort acted as a mini-army, large enough to fight independently, but small enough to remain flexible. This change brought several huge advantages. Simpler command. Instead of coordinating 30 maniples, a general now directed just 10 cohorts. Orders could be given and executed much more quickly. Stronger formations. A cohort was big enough to hold its own in the thick of battle. Soldiers could rely on the strength of a solid block of comrades beside them. Unity and morale. With fewer, larger units, soldiers developed a stronger sense of identity and loyalty to their cohort, which boosted morale. Versatility. Cohorts could be deployed separately for small engagements or massed together for a crushing blow. The cohort system turned the Roman legion into a flexible war machine, able to fight against nimble guerrilla fighters in Spain, massive tribal hordes in Gaul, or disciplined phalanxes in Greece. It was a brilliant balance of organization and adaptability, one that would define Roman warfare for centuries. Long after Marius was gone, the cohort system remained the backbone of the legions that conquered and held an empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia. Standardization. The legion as a perfect war machine. One of Gaius Marius' most revolutionary ideas was the standardization of the Roman army. Before his reforms, legions were often a patchwork of men with differing equipment depending on personal wealth or regional traditions. Some soldiers carried heavier armor, others lighter gear, and this inconsistency often caused confusion on the battlefield. Marius changed all of this by introducing uniformity in training, equipment, and organization, effectively transforming the Roman legion into a war machine that could operate with clockwork precision. Every soldier was equipped with the same weapons and armor: the deadly short sword known as the gladius, a pair of throwing spears or pila, a rectangular shield called the scutum, and standardized helmets and armor. This meant that every legionary could fight in the same way, replace a fallen comrade in the formation without hesitation, and maintain the integrity of the line under pressure. No longer was a Roman army a collection of individuals, it was a single, cohesive killing machine. Training also became uniform. Marius introduced rigorous drills where soldiers practiced marching long distances with full packs, throwing their pili in unison, and locking their shields to form the famous testudo, or tortoise formation. The focus was on discipline, endurance, and coordination. This standardization created a legion that was not only physically strong but also mentally conditioned to act as one body, following orders without hesitation. Equally important was the reorganization of the legion itself. Instead of the older, more rigid manipular system, Marius grouped soldiers into cohorts of about 480 men. Each cohort could function independently or as part of the larger legion, giving commanders far greater flexibility on the battlefield. This system meant that a Roman army could adapt quickly to unexpected situations, surround enemies, or hold defensive lines with incredible efficiency. This level of standardization was unique in the ancient world. Where other armies relied on raw numbers, local levies, or elite units, Rome fielded legions where every soldier was trained, armed, and organized to the same high standard. The result? An army that could march farther, fight longer, and adapt faster than almost any opponent it faced. Marius had not just created soldiers, he had created a military system, a self-sustaining engine of conquest. The legion became Rome's ultimate weapon, capable of crushing tribal war bands, holding its own against professional enemies, and projecting Roman power across continents. The test of fire, proving Rome's new army. Reforms are only as good as their results. For Gaius Marius, the ultimate test of his new military machine came not in training grounds but on the battlefield, against enemies who threatened the very survival of Rome. The years following the Marian Reforms would prove beyond doubt that his legions were no ordinary army. They were an unstoppable force, forged by discipline, standardization, and sheer resilience. The first great challenge came from the Cimbri and Teutons, massive Germanic tribes that swept down into Roman territory like a tidal wave. These were not small raiding parties, but migrating nations, tens of thousands strong, bringing their families, wagons, and warriors in a terrifying advance. Rome had already suffered humiliating defeats at their hands, and the Republic was in a state of panic. It was Marius and his newly reformed legions who stood between Rome and annihilation. When the Teutons descended into Gaul in 102 BC, Marius' soldiers demonstrated everything the reforms had built. The legions endured brutal forced marches, carried their own supplies without faltering, and constructed fortified camps every night. On the battlefield, they fought not as individuals but as a unified wall of steel. At the Battle of Aquae Sextiae, Marius crushed the Teutons so completely that tens of thousands were slain or captured. The Roman soldiers, once mocked as Marius mules for their heavy burdens, had proven themselves as an indomitable engine of war. The following year, in 101 BC, the Cimbri met the same fate at the Battle of Vercelli. Facing perhaps one of the largest tribal armies ever assembled, Marius' legions stood firm. Cohorts maneuvered with precision, pila rained down on enemy ranks, and the relentless advance of the gladius-bearing infantry shattered the tribal lines. What had once been seen as an existential threat to Rome was annihilated, securing Marius a place as the savior of the Republic. But the Marian legions did not stop there. In later decades, the same system enabled Rome to fight wars across vast distances, from Spain to the Balkans, from North Africa to Asia Minor. Commanders like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar inherited this war machine, using it to defeat foes as varied as Mithridates of Pontus, the Numidians under Jugurtha, and the Gauls under Vercingetorix. The consistency of training, equipment, and organization meant that no matter where Rome's armies marched, they could adapt to local conditions and crush their enemies with frightening efficiency. The Marian Reforms didn't just win battles, they changed the balance of power in the ancient world. Rome was no longer dependent on citizen soldiers who returned to their farms after a campaign. It now commanded a professional military force, ready to march at a moment's notice, capable of sustained wars of expansion. This gave the Republic, and later the Empire, the ability to project power across Europe, Africa, and Asia for centuries. In short, the Marian Reforms were not a temporary fix. They had laid the foundation for an empire. Every victory, every conquest, every province brought under Rome's control in the centuries that followed was, in some way, a testament to the changes Marius made. By the time Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he was leading not just men, but the perfected product of Marius' vision, the unstoppable Roman legion. The legacy of Marius' reforms. The Marian reforms were more than just a set of military adjustments. They were a turning point in world history. By opening the legions to Rome's poorest citizens, by standardizing training and equipment, by reshaping the army into powerful cohorts, Marius built not just an army, he built an institution of conquest. An institution that would carry Roman standards across 3 continents, forging an empire unlike anything the world had ever seen. But this unstoppable war machine came with a price. Soldiers no longer fought for the Senate or the Republic. They fought for the generals who paid them, led them, and promised them land. Loyalty shifted from Rome itself to ambitious men like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar. The very strength of Marius' army became the weapon that tore the Republic apart. Civil war followed, and with it, the rise of emperors who would rule in place of the Senate. Yet despite this dark legacy, one truth remains: without the Marian reforms, there is no Caesar, no Augustus, no Roman Empire. The reforms gave Rome the power to dominate the ancient world, to expand from a regional republic to a global superpower. And though the republic fell, the legions endured, carrying the mark of Marius for centuries. From the hills of Gaul to the sands of Africa, from the forests of Germania to the deserts of the Middle East, the thunder of Roman boots was the echo of Marius' vision. A vision that turned farmers and paupers into soldiers, soldiers into legions, and legions into the iron fist of an empire. The Marian reforms forged the unstoppable war machine that made Rome eternal.